Well, it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, who is Ruth Schwartz Cowan. And it gives me particular pleasure because this is a celebration within SHOT, not just our first time in Asia, but the 40th anniversary of WITH, Women in Technology History, or Women in Technology History. And I think, for me, certainly, the application of feminist theory within history of technology was one of the most dramatic and transformational events in its intellectual history. So I'm very proud that SHOT has among us one of its most outstanding proponents, and that she will speak to us today. Ruth Schwartz Cowan, I'm sure, is known to all of you as a historian not only of technology, but of science, technology, and medicine. She's the author of a number of books, all of them path-breaking, as well as numerous articles. And I think the one that initially changed our lives and our disciplines was More Work for Mother, The Ironies of Household Technology, From the Open Hearth to the Microwave, which was published in 1983. Since then, she has published a number of books, working her way through genetic screening and the social history of American technology, and a book on our parents' lives, The Americanization of Eastern European Jews. She is a professor at Johns Hopkins University, she said, hopefully, having lost that bit of her notes. University of Pennsylvania. Sorry, sisterhood is powerful and will forgive. And she is one of the founding members of Women in Technology History. She has been an inspiration to us all in the past, and she is an inspiration and a path breaker for us today. So I'm extremely happy to welcome Ruth Cowan to talk to us and as a plenary lecturer.
My title to myself of this keynote address is Continuing to Think with Technology and Gender. Those of you who were lucky enough to attend the SHOT meeting in Dearborn, Michigan 2 years ago will know that I borrowed the locution "thinking with" from the very first presidential roundtable, which was meant, I believe, to be a precursor to this very meeting, which was called Thinking with Asia. I have no idea who came up with that locution, but I was taken with it at the time, and I still am. I'm taken with the difference between thinking with a concept as opposed to thinking about a concept. And although I cannot yet articulate why the two rhetorical forms are so different, I know that with what I want to say today falls most appropriately under the rubric of thinking with. And so I'm going to continue to use that somewhat new phraseology in this talk. I started thinking with technology and with gender, although I wouldn't have thought to phrase it that way, in 1970, almost a half century ago, when I decided both to retrain myself in the history of technology, having started my academic career as an historian of science, and also in social history, having started my academic career doing intellectual history. The project that required all that retraining was to be an investigation of the impact of changing household technologies on women's lives, American women's lives. When I started the project, I already knew that housework was work because I was doing a fair amount of it myself. But it took me almost a decade of thinking with both technology and gender to fully understand that all work is gendered and that all workers use technology. At that point, I started thinking not just with technology and not just with gender, but also with work. By 1983, as Francesca just told you, that was 13 years after I started, that project finally emerged as a book called More Work for Mother. I really did feel that as a scholar, once that book was published in 1983, I did not want to do housework anymore. Although, as a mother then of 3 children and the co-owner of a fairly large house, I continued to do a fair amount of housework. I was eager to continue with thinking with technology, with gender, and with work, but about a very different topic, a history of the technologies with which various kinds of genetic screening and testing are done. That project took even longer to emerge as a book, 25 years rather than 13. And during all that time, that quarter of a century, I pretty much ignored, except for occasionally agreeing to review a manuscript or a book on the subject, the growing literature on the history of household technologies, not just in the US, but in many other parts of the world. Within the last 12 months, however, 3 things happened that caused me to go back to thinking about housework. The first thing to happen in time was an invitation to give this keynote address, which happened to be accompanied by a note from Francesca Bray encouraging me to use the occasion to reevaluate the trajectory of my own work. The second, which happened about a month later, was a long-planned trip to Cuba. The third, occasioned by something that happened during that trip, which I will tell you about in a few minutes, was several months of immersion in one subsection of that very literature that I had been ignoring for all that time. And the fourth, while I was deep into that reading, was another invitation to give a keynote address, this time at what turned out to be the remarkable meeting that was planned on the campus of the Stevens Institute of Technology early in April, called The Maintainers, and which should have had, maybe also did have, a subtitle, as opposed to The Innovators. So I will start the body of my talk now by telling you about my trip to Cuba and the remarkable, to me anyway, thing that happened while I was there. This past November, I traveled to Cuba on an educational tour that was organized by The Nation magazine. I wanted to learn about it insofar it was possible in 8 days to experience one of the only 2 still living communist, or if you prefer, state socialist economies in the world. I had many fascinating experiences and heard many fascinating lectures delivered by Cuban experts during those 8 days. And one of them, a lecture on race and gender in Cuba, delivered by Marta Nunez, a professor of sociology at the University of Havana, was particularly troubling. Nunez began by extolling the positive effects of the Cuban Revolution on women. Policies introduced, she said, in the early 1960s, equal pay for equal work, equal access to education at all levels, equal cost-free access to health care, including access to both contraception and abortion, had, she said, ended discrimination against and created equal opportunity for women. About midway through the lecture, however, she admitted that there was one aspect of Cuban life revealed in one discordant piece of data that continued to discriminate the existence of at least one form of discrimination. The datum was that the life expectancy of Cuban women was about 5 years lower than the life expectancy of Cuban men, a phenomenon that she knew to be exactly the reverse of what it pertains in all of the developed countries of the West. Her explanation for this discrepancy was not, as it might have been before the mid-20th century, the death of Cuban women in childbirth. No, she declared, the explanation was that the revolution had failed to either improve or to maintain the housing stock that it had nationalized, which meant that housework in Cuba had never stopped being difficult, indeed, back-breaking work, and Cuban women, despite the best of revolutionary intentions, had continued to do it all. When Núñez was asked why Cuban men did not share housework, she replied in a way that I found so troubling that it continued to bother me for days and weeks afterwards. There were 2 reasons, she said. The first was that Cuban women refused to ask their sons to help with household chores. That is, they refused to train their sons to be skilled at that work, for fear that their sons would appear to be gay, that their sexual identities would be shamefully revealed through their work. The second reason was that women, Cuban women, were reluctant to share housework with men because functioning household appliances were extremely scarce and extremely difficult to repair in Cuba. So men had to be kept away from them lest they end up broken. I laughed at first and then I started to cry inside because my first reaction to this set of explanation was that Núñez was doing something that no socially conscious person should ever do, that is, blaming the victim. A day or 2 later, however, while walking on the streets of Havana and continuing to mull over the lecture, I suddenly realized that those 2 explanations that she had offered about why Cuban men did not do housework were absolutely as familiar to me as the cars that were occasionally passing me by on the streets of Havana. That is, they both came straight out of America in the 1950s. The culture in which I had been raised. I had grown up in a culture in which the sexuality of both men and women was stereotypically judged by the work that they did. Also in a culture in which adult women were, again, stereotypically assumed to be unable to manipulate complex machines, like cars, without breaking them. And men were assumed to be unable to do even such a simple household chore as boiling water or scrambling eggs. How, I wondered to myself, could a gender ideology straight out of the capitalist consumerist culture of the 1950s, the culture in which I had grown up, be alive and well in a state socialist, anti-consumerist culture a half-century later? By the time I got home from Cuba, I had decided that this very question was going to be the focus of this lecture. And I began reading in what I already knew to be a voluminous literature, especially in sociology and anthropology, about gender relations in communist and post-communist countries, as well in the somewhat less voluminous but nonetheless existent secondary literature about gender relations in Cuba. Here's what I discovered in the course of the reading about Cuba. Before the Cuban Revolution of 1959, Cuba was a stereotypically Latin macho culture. Women were stereotypically of the house, and men were, again, stereotypically, of the street. Two of the many corollary features of this kind of culture are, of course, that men, then and now, rarely do anything even vaguely resembling housework, and homosexuality is generally abhorred. This culture did not change despite some rhetoric and legislation about men needing to share the burden of housework after the revolution, and is still the case today. Second, the Cuban Revolution did not expropriate all of the social and economic functions of the traditional Cuban family. Yes, it did provide daycare centers for babies and children so that their mothers could be employed. And yes, it did subsidize the cost of basic food stuff so that no one would starve. But it did not create communal kitchens and dining halls. It did not provide care centers for children who were too ill to go to school. And it did not provide care centers for disabled or elderly adults who could not go to work or care for themselves. It also did not provide maintenance services for residential property, even though all of that property was owned by the state. To put this another way, the revolutionary government of Cuba drew a circle of privacy around the household into which the state decided not to intrude and for which the state decided not to provide. Third, the Cuban economy collapsed in 1989, 30 years after the revolution, when the economic subsidies that had been provided by the Soviet Union were suddenly withdrawn, leaving Cuban households thrown quite suddenly into a state of extreme economic immiseration. At the same time, the housing stock, which, as I just said, the revolutionary government had not been attending to for a variety of reasons in the previous 30 years, began to deteriorate even faster, a form of what might be called technological immiseration. Cubans referred to the 2 decades after 1989 as the special period, capital S, capital P. Whole industries shut down for lack of fuel or for lack of machine parts or for lack of raw materials. Many people lost their jobs. Simultaneously, municipal services evaporated. Electric service became sporadic. Water did not flow from taps. If it did, it had to be boiled in order to be consumable. Public transportation facilities failed, disappeared, so that the trip to and from work took almost as long for many people as the workday itself did. Food supplies dwindled. Then and now, Cuba imported more than half of its food staples. And such common necessities as aspirin and soap and toothpaste disappeared. At which point, of course, the maintenance and sustenance of the population became, to put it mildly, exceedingly difficult. In order to cope with the difficulties of the special period, Cuban women created what might be called multigynous households, households containing more than one adult woman, daughters with mothers and grandmothers, sisters and sisters-in-law with each other, friends and neighbors together with all the children. Households consisting of many adults with the skills needed to maintain and sustain themselves and everyone else. One woman might be able to continue her employment. She might spend her day at a job, while the other women cooperated to provide the care that the rest of the household required. All kinds of workarounds developed. In the absence of pumps, water got hauled upstairs in buckets attached to clothesline pulley systems. If one household had fuel, it did the cooking for several. If one had water and a functioning washing machine, it could trade laundry for meals or for childcare. If one had if one household had relatives in the country or could maintain a rooftop garden or chicken coop, it could trade fresh foods for other kinds of household services. Stray cats and dogs disappeared from the streets. Women learned to make nutritious stews and soups from the peels of bananas and plantains. Men drifted between the households in which their mothers or their wives or their girlfriends or their children lived, sometimes contributing cash or items purchased for cash on the black market. But it was households, always defined by women, who kept the population of Cuba going. The words that these women created for their workarounds, for these clever collaborative solutions, for these creative improvisations to the huge problem of maintaining human life and human health during an economic emergency which stretched on for more than a decade, was and is extremely telling for my purposes in this lecture. They called them in Spanish inventos, inventions or innovations in English. Cuban domestic innovation, one Cuban housewife was recently quoted in, of all places, the food section of the New York Times. Cuban domestic innovation, she said, is the innovation that comes, and I'm quoting now, from the lap of desperation. Please remember that word, desperation. I'll come back to Cuba in a moment, but I want first to tell you that this is where the invitation to give a keynote address at a conference on maintainers, coupled with my now habitual tendency to think with technology, with gender, and with work, led me to two new insights about housework, both of them connected to my struggles with Marta Nunez's lecture. As I was preparing that keynote address, I realized that housework is maintenance work. Just as maintenance work is essential to economies because it keeps infrastructures functioning, housework is maintenance work because it keeps people functioning. To put the matter in something akin to techno-speak, housework gets the fuel we call food into our systems. It shelters our bodies from the elements that might throw those bodies into disrepair. And when disrepair occurs, housework repairs bodies. As I began to think about housework this way, I began to realize that the social goal of housework can be thought of as maintaining people's bodies precisely so that they can get out of the house, off to school or to work, in the fields or in an office, in good enough shape to be productive. Unfed or unrested children cannot learn. Workers cannot work. Uncared for, the sick cannot be returned to health, and the disabled cannot function. Which means that, rightly considered, I think, housework is absolutely essential economic work, because when it is not performed, or when it is performed badly, people cannot do other kinds of work. Housework, in other words, maintains the economy by maintaining the workers. In this sense, housework, women's work, doesn't really, as the Chinese say, hold up half the world. It holds up the whole world, because without it, nothing else and no one else can work. Furthermore, housework, I began to realize, like maintenance work, is socially devalued work when compared, for example, to managerial work or creative work or academic work. Devalued, that is, until something goes wrong, until there is an emergency, until some system fails That's when the maintenance worker, the plumber, the electrician, the car mechanic, the computer repairman become exceedingly valuable, both socially and economically. And when something broke in Cuba, when the Cuban economy collapsed after the Soviet subsidy was withdrawn, it turns out housewives and housework all of a sudden became exceedingly valuable. This is another thing that I learned in my reading of the secondary literature. Recognizing that the maintenance and the sustenance of the Cuban population was now more dependent on the housework skills of Cuban women than on their workplace skills, the Cuban government promptly reversed ideological course. It promptly, to use its own vocabulary, initiated what could properly be called a re-education campaign. A re-education campaign to revalorize not just the home, but also the woman's place in the home. I have this information, this analysis, on the scholarly word of Anna Cristina Pertiera, an Australian anthropologist, whose dissertation was based on extensive reading of Cuban women's magazines, all of them state publications, and extensive interviews with Cuban housewives in the late 1990s, when the special period was a decade old. Pertiera argues that in the special period, the Cuban government revalorized, that's her term, not just the home, but also what American feminists have long called the doctrine of separate spheres, that women are of the home and men are of the street, as well as the other doctrine, the cult of true womanhood, the notion that this binary separation is performed through separate forms of work, is biologically normal, and is therefore both morally and normatively crucial. I'm now going to quote from Pertiera's text. The daily lives of women in post-Soviet Cuba center upon the household, not the workplace. To a degree that might seem surprising given the socialist revolution's promotion of equality of the sexes and more than 4 decades of provision of extensive state services. In the post-Soviet era, traditional associations of women with the household have become even more comprehensive than they were in preceding decades. Cuban women, Pertiera goes on to say, are not interested in sharing household responsibilities with men because they retain a firm association between domestic space and feminine morality. The household is also, to the Cuban woman, an especially important sphere from which she can draw status and mark identity. Since coming back from Cuba, I have been reading extensively, also in the anthropological and sociological literature, about gender and housework in many post-state socialist nations, not just Cuba, but also China, Poland, Russia, Hungary, and Romania. Everywhere the story seems to be the same. Despite, or maybe because of, the revolutionary emphasis on equality for women and workforce participation for women, either in the post-Soviet period or in the post-Maoist period, the cult of true womanhood and the doctrine of special spheres have resurfaced. In all of those countries, in all of those very different cultures, one Latin, one Asian, a few Slavic, post-revolutionary women have developed a firm association, as Pertiera put it, between domestic space and feminine morality, and they are proud to draw their status from the work that they do in their households and to signify their identity by using and controlling the tools with which they do their work. The Victorian gender binary, then, which women's historians used to understand is intimately connected to the rise of industrial and consumerist capitalism, has, like a phoenix, arisen once again in places with state-owned and state-managed industrial in places in which state-managed industrial technological systems have broken, have either created in their broken state, they have either created or increased poverty, they have failed to provide people with economic security and opportunity, and people have needed to fall back upon the private, the intimate, and the gendered household work in order to maintain their bodies and maintain their health. I'm going to digress again for another autobiographical reflection by way of starting my conclusion. Even before I began to think with technology rather than science and gender rather than sex, and even before I had begun to think about work rather than study, while I was still a graduate student, more than a half century ago, I began to develop an aversion to historiographical theory. And that aversion became even stronger for a variety of reasons as my scholarly career progressed. As a result of this aversion, I rarely read theoretical works, even works in feminist theory, and I rarely included theoretical work on graduate course reading lists, and I regularly told my graduate students that there were only two generalizations that I was willing to make about history. The first is, there are no laws of history. And the second is, because history, like life, is complicated, nothing important happens for just one reason. In thinking about Marta Nunes, about why Marta Nunes's lecture troubled me, in thinking about the relation between gender and technology in light of my new inquiries into housework and gender relations, it one day dawned on me that if I had been paying more attention to theory, particularly feminist cultural theory over the last several decades, I would have also understood that the connections I had once drawn when thinking with technology and gender and work, the connections between both conceptual domains and the domain of work, were incomplete. That there are two more conceptual domains with which I have to start to think, and which I believe all of us historians of technology and of gender and of the relationships between technology and gender may want to consider thinking. So if I were still teaching graduate seminars, I would tell my students that my recent foray into the history of housework has caused me to add two more generalizations to which I was so recently only willing to commit. I still think that there are no historical laws, except that history, like life, is complicated, which means that nothing important happens or fails to happen for just one reason. But there are two reasons, two concepts with which I have now become familiar with thinking, and which I urge us all as historians of technology and gender to start thinking. Two domains that we have failed to take seriously enough and to fail to think with: the domain of poverty and the domain of identity. Both of these, I think, are really important historical reasons that complicate lives, that are determinative of both the rate and the character of both technological and social change, whether technological change moves towards centralization and moves fast or moves slow, whether it moves toward increased privacy or less privacy, whether social change moves towards less stereotypical thinking or more stereotypical thinking, whether it moves toward more invasions of privacy, whether it moves toward less ability to have the right of free speech. We need to start thinking with poverty and thinking with identity to do it more than we have previously admitted to our philosophizing. Thank you.
I was wondering if you expanded your focus and asked a question, what are the most gendered forms of work in all of human history? And could you identify them, and could you find common characteristics for why they became so gendered, unlike other forms of work? I have in mind, by the way, militaries. Why are they? Well, but no, I don't think so.
It's now turned.
It is now.
Okay. My first impulse, until you said the word military, was to go back to something I actually said but didn't emphasize possibly enough in my lecture. That is, I think all forms of work are gendered. How they are gendered has changed over time, but they're always gendered. So that there was a time when what we now call obstetrics and gynecological work was female work. And then there was a time when it became predominantly male work. And now it's back to being female work, but females who are trained in a different way. There was a time when clerical work was male work, then it became female work, then it disappeared. Maybe it became computer work. But it's certainly on its way to becoming data processing. It was female work when the punch cards had to be punched and put into machines. So there's always a gender somewhere. Military work, as far as I know, has been gendered male as long as there has been warfare. But I could be wrong about that. I haven't studied it. What do you think?
Predominantly, we have very few examples.
I'm afraid you're going to have to use the microphone.
Yes, it's been almost exclusively male with a few exceptions. But what I was trying to get at is there something in the way human communities have evolved that make some kinds of work intractably gendered, whereas others seem less resistant to change over time, and as you say, have actually gone back and forth historically. And some, there's some handful, surely, that are hardly gendered at all, being a wait person or a store clerk or something like that.
Well, there was certainly a time within my living memory in which the overwhelming assumption in all fields of study of work was that, yes, there were some forms of work which were both normatively and biologically and normally gendered female, and other forms normally, biologically, morally gendered male. In the last half century, I would say that that notion has been disproved over and over and over again. The examples I used to give when I gave survey lecture courses on these kinds of subjects have to do with the notion, one notion, which is that because men have greater upper body strength, their work involves, the work that involves upper body strength is gendered male and should continue to be gendered male. Well, all you have to do is spend 10 minutes in Delhi watching women carrying bricks in trays on their heads to understand that you can do that without being male. So, and then there was the other commonly said thing, that women have more flexible fingers and more, there's a psychological word for being able to do small things with your fingers, and that's why women should sew. And that's why women should type, because they are, turns out that when you degender a typing class and call it keyboarding, boys do it just as well as girls. So that's the first part of my answer to your question. Second part of my question has to do with something that I have been thinking about since I started thinking with poverty and identity. I can't help but wonder whether the end of gendered work, and we are, I think, at least in the United States and in the developed parts of the West, we do now see some forms of non-gendered work. Actually, the example of obstetrics and gynecology, I unfairly now said has become gendered. In fact, about 50% of obstetricians and gynecologists are now male, and the other half are female. And so you could say it's become neuter work. I can't help but wonder whether we have to have affluence before we can get there. That in conditions of poverty, people need to be able to do the skills in which they and their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents have perfected, so that people can be maintained, households can be maintained, occupations can be maintained. It's only in affluence that you can gender bend work. That's just a guess on my part, but it's one of the things that's been bumping around in my head since I started to think with identity and with poverty.
Thank you for your talk. And just something you were saying right then kind of made my question a little easier. I'm wondering if it's not only just thinking through affluence or having affluence to make gender bending work possible, but if it's also something you were arguing a little earlier, but the construction or the organization of work. So work being privatized outside of the realm of the state, and that being left to the women, but also not creating economic value. Because something I was thinking of during your talk was social reproduction of labor theory, which is what I was really familiar with when I came to your book. So it's interesting, I read your book through that lens as a perfect companion and, you know, really just putting kind of empirical evidence to that theory.
Oh, Emily, I'm sorry to hear that. I'll explain why. I referred in passing to my aversion to historiographical theory, and that I said there were many reasons for it. The aversion started when I was a graduate student, when theory meant philosophy of science, which had nothing to do with, it had everything to do with physics and nothing to do with biology, which is what I was studying. But my aversion got even stronger when I started to do the project on housework. Because of the then reigning theories, one of which was functionalism, and the other one of which was, you might call, I called it Marxism, or feminist Marxism, which was the social reproduction of labor part. Both of them seemed to me entirely inadequate to explaining what the complexities that I was discovering as I began to look at the relationship between household technology and housework, the gendering of housework. And so my aversion, the reason I stopped reading that stuff was partly because of what I conceived as the inadequacies of the social reproduction of labor theory. I don't think that answers your question.
And I was wondering if you could expand on one of your last comments, stating that historians have neglected the history of identity. And what I'm finding in my own work is that there's, in the last 15 years or so, there's been an incredibly rich literature on identity. And I'm wondering if you could expand on the ways you think historians are failing to address concepts of identity.
I didn't mean to say, and if I did, I correct myself, thank you,
Okay.
That historians had failed. I meant to say that historians of technology have failed
Okay.
to focus on the technologies of identity. I know that historians have done it. I just don't think we've done it
I see.
as well as we might.
Okay, thank you.
Although, in truth to tell, I didn't know it until I started going back to read the literature, including the literature of feminist cultural theory, which I had completely blown off.